Era assim que o brasileiro via o mercado financeiro. Uma escuridão total. Foi aí que, em um pequeno escritório, a XP abriu suas portas. E ao ligar a luz, acendeu muito mais que o espaço de 25 metros quadrados. Iluminou o caminho para os investimentos além dos bancos. 2011. Chegava o momento de compartilhar o que a gente havia aprendido. Nascia a Expert XP. Ano a ano, seguimos investindo em conteúdo. O brasileiro crescendo em conhecimento. E assim, transformamos o futuro. Já somos milhões de mentes acesas, com muito mais clareza em nossas escolhas. Tornamos o conhecimento acessível a todos. E estamos apenas no começo. Bem-vindo à Expert XP 2021, o maior festival sobre investimento do mundo.
Olá, pessoal! Seja muito bem-vindo, muito bem-vinda ao segundo dia da Expert XP 2021. E esse aqui é o palco Parceiros, que traz conteúdos desenvolvidos pelos nossos patrocinadores, especialmente para você aí de casa. E eu sou a Mônica Iose, sou a mestre de cerimônias. Olha só, gente, hoje a gente vai começar o nosso dia aqui, ao ar livre, curtindo esse clima perfeito que só uma experiência digital imersiva pode criar. Aliás, clima é um dos temas que os nossos parceiros da Wellington Management Company apresentam para a gente agora. Clima, China e Cyber. Os 3 Cs que dominam o universo da geopolítica atual. Você sabia disso? Porque eu não sabia. Mas assim, tudo bem, né, pessoal? A gente está aqui para aprender mesmo. E para falar com a gente sobre esse assunto, a gente recebe o Thomas Mucha num papo gravado e legendado que é para ninguém perder, tadinha. Expert XP 2021. Investir em conhecimento transforma o futuro.
Good evening, Asia. Good afternoon, London. Good morning, Radna. And good morning here in Boston.
Welcome to Wellington and welcome to our morning meeting.
So we have a very full docket this morning. We have
Tim, so I wanted to look back in terms of the forecast.
We host morning meetings so that our investment professionals all around the globe have a daily forum to exchange and to debate ideas.
Hello, my name is Samuel Ponsoni. I'm a portfolio manager at XP Asset Management, and today I'm pleased to receive Thomas Mucha, who is a manager director and geopolitical strategist at Wellington Management. Thomas, thank you very much for being with us.
Samuel, it's an honor. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thomas, I would like to have you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your experience covering geopolitical issues, and then we're going to go through some questions we prepared for you.
Sure.
What about it?
Sure. So just to give you a 30,000-foot view of my role at the firm and what my responsibilities are at Wellington. So I'm the firm's geopolitical strategist. I sit on the firm's broader macro team, and that's my job essentially to assess the geopolitical backdrop, what that means for markets, what that means for our investment strategies. I spend a lot of my time with investors all across the firm on the equity side, the fixed income side, the alternative side, privates, publics, the whole gamut. I also develop my own investment strategies based on geopolitical research. On the external side, I spend a lot of time with clients in discussions like this, advising our clients globally on the big changes that are happening around the world. And on the research side, I spend a lot of time with US foreign policy professionals. So current and former CIA, Pentagon, State Department, national security officials, White House officials. I spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, as well as with national security professionals all around the world. So what you'll hear from me today will largely reflect those conversations that I'm having with policymakers all around the world on the geopolitical side.
Great, thank you. The focus of our conversation will be three big C's that may move the markets a lot in the future, as it is already doing actually, which are climate, China, and cybersecurity. Three extremely important topics in the current geopolitical scenario. I would like to start our conversation covering the climate topic. Could you share with us in a short version, due to our limited time, what are the main concerns you see in this area and how we could address or at least mitigate them?
Sure. Now we could spend 3 days talking about this, but I'll try to hit the high points. And I'm also sorry to say that this may not be a pleasant conversation at times, given the subject matter. But I do think it's very important, particularly in national security circles. And I think it's critical to how we should be thinking about the broader geopolitical backdrop, as well as, of course, the broader macro environment. And I do think that climate change is still largely underappreciated by the markets, though the recent Intergovernmental Panel and Climate Change report on climate that we got a couple weeks ago, and specifically the dire warnings within it, may change that fact. But here's why I think climate is so important to both the geopolitical and macro backdrops. It's global. It comes amid rising great power competition and rising geopolitical risks, and in an environment where COVID inequalities are likely to further stress domestic and international politics. And the Pentagon has a term for climate change. They call it a complex catastrophe. And under the Biden administration, the national security impact of climate change is becoming a much bigger part of the climate policy narrative. The language and tone shift is already evident. It's one of the big changes, obviously, from the Trump administration, which barely acknowledged climate change publicly. But this issue of climate change, specifically related to national security, it's been in the foreign policy background for decades. The CIA and the Pentagon began studying climate change way back in the early 1990s. And frankly, they saw this coming. And senior Pentagon officials really have worried for decades about the impacts and have seen firsthand around the world in past, present, and future military missions. So it really is central to the long-term geopolitical backdrop.
Great, great. What about the impact of climate changes in the geopolitical scenario, especially in the regions with potential border conflicts, like China and India, for example?
Yeah, Samuel, there are two dimensions to this topic that I think are really important for this audience to understand from a geopolitical perspective. I'll dive into both as quickly as I can. The first one is that climate change is already stressing the geopolitical backdrop, particularly in areas on the equator and 30 degrees north and south of there. This is where climate change is hitting hardest. It's also home to some of the biggest geopolitical hotspots in the world already. Syria is the classic example of this, as drought contributed greatly to that country's social, economic, and religious divisions. But this is also true in Yemen, in East, West, North Africa, in the South China Sea, as you say, on the India-China border, the India-Pakistan border. It also includes large parts of Latin America, such as Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, across Central America and the Caribbean. This will only get worse, and national security planners are forecasting what they call catastrophic impacts in these areas over the next decade and longer if we remain on current CO2 trajectories. So from a strict global stability perspective, climate change dominates the national security future.
What would be catastrophic and what is future? Is it in 50 years or in 10 years?
So I think it's closer than the market currently anticipates. We're already seeing impacts already. A brief glance at the headlines today shows a huge increase in climate-related storms, wildfires, flooding, droughts, and on and on and on. But what the Pentagon refers to when they say catastrophic impacts is they're essentially worried about a long list of nightmares that are related to climate that will create global shockwaves, and many of which are already here, Samuel. I'll run through a couple just so you have a sense of this. Increased migration is really at the top of the worry list. That's hugely destabilizing in general to the geopolitical backdrop. But others are water scarcity, food shortages due to climate shifts, droughts, flooding, fishing stock shortages as ocean currents shift and species are impacted, increased disease vectors, more pandemics, rising religious and other political extremism, increased domestic political stability. I could go on and on here, but you get the sense of how climate exacerbates current existing geopolitical challenges. And it's not just the individual factors that the Pentagon is so concerned about. It's the combination of these factors that has national security planners so concerned. They call this a threat multiplier. One cascading onto another. And this is hitting an already deeply challenged geopolitical backdrop. So it does raise the specter of systemic collapse in societies in these high risk zones. The other really important dimension of this, Samuel, is that climate change is already impacting US military capacity, just as demand for this will rise in this more destabilized world. According to the Pentagon, about 2/3 of all US military bases inside the continental US have already been impacted by climate-related events, droughts, floods, storms, wildfires. This includes some of the most important national security infrastructure that the United States has, like Norfolk, Virginia, which has persistent day flooding, in addition to being home to the world's largest naval base and 30 other US military installations. Air Force bases in Florida have been hit. The Camp Lejeune Marine Corps base in North Carolina also been hit by hurricanes. They're also concerned about a 60% increase in heat-related illnesses among US troops. And so if you look at the global nature of climate change and the fact that it's going to lead to a further destabilized geopolitical backdrop at the same time that it's hitting military capacity to respond, the Pentagon is quite concerned about this.
Great. And it's not so obvious what I'm going to ask, but where do you guys see the main opportunities here? I know we're talking about catastrophes, we're talking about disasters, but we're also talking about investments. Where does Wellington see opportunities here? How to make profit under this very dark scenario?
So there's plenty to discuss here, and as the firm's geopolitical strategist, I am at the center of ongoing investment impact discussions around the firm related to climate change. So, the first thing I'd say is there's a lot happening inside Wellington around climate in general. But I'll emphasize sort of two broad investment areas that I think are really important when it comes to thinking about the investment impacts of climate change. The first is I have a very strong conviction that climate adaptation is the most direct way to approach these structural climate challenges that are coming down the pike. Investing in adaptation, how to make a society more resilient to higher temperatures, more flooding, more storms, drought, water scarcity. I I think of that as an insurance policy against a lot of these worst case scenarios that I just mentioned from the Pentagon's perspective. You know, the IPCC said in its latest report, climate change is unequivocal and now irreversible. So I think governments, businesses, individuals, states will need to invest significantly in resiliency to cope with these warming temperatures, rising sea levels, increased storms, droughts, and all these other climate variables that we study at Wellington. And I think this is doubly true when you layer on the national security implications of this. So I think of adaptation really as the most practical way to invest here as the world attempts to manage the coming climate disruptions. It's both offensive from a investment perspective, but also defensive. And I think this will be a long-term demand tailwind across the board. You know, I'm part of the team that created Wellington's climate adaptation strategy, which actually grew out of my geopolitical research. So I've been very close to this particular development, and we approach this, you know, very systematically by climate variables that we think are most important to the investment backdrop. So heat, water scarcity, changes to agriculture, flooding, wildfires, hurricanes, and we tie this to revenue generation. So what we're looking for are companies that derive at least 50% of their revenue needs from these adaptations, you know, tied to at least one of these variables. This is also, you know, from a Wellington perspective, tied very closely to the climate science research that we do with the Woodwell Climate Research Center every week. And this is a group of the world's top climate scientists, and I have the pleasure of sitting down with them every week to hear their views on the latest climate science and to think about how to apply that more broadly to our many investment strategies. So it's very scientific, it's very disciplined, and it's very much tied to practical solutions on the adaptation side. You know, that doesn't mean that you know, the other piece of this, the mitigation piece of it, isn't as important. We think that's just as important as well. That's essentially making investments in this transition to renewables, to a greener economy. You know, we need both. Excuse me. We need both of these aspects to happen. And from an investment perspective, we think that's going to create all sorts of opportunities. The last thing I'd say about this, Samuel, is you know, I see sustained demand for national security investments as great power competition merges with climate change. You know, these are two broad megatrends with long-term and profound investment applications. And so, you know, we've got, you know, two things that are happening at the same time here: climate change and great power competition, and they're merging together. So, you know, those are a couple of ways to think about the investment impacts here.
Great. Moving to our second C, let's talk a little bit about China. How do you see the latest interventions of the government in the market? Is it something more structural that should be taken more seriously by investors, or is it just noise and eventually a buy opportunity? How do you see that?
Yeah, those are great questions, Samuel. I think the recent regulatory moves by Jing are mainly China related and not entirely driven by geopolitics or policy shifts in the US. But I do think there are some important geopolitical takeaways here. And I do think the broader geopolitical context is important because domestic policies in both China and especially in the US are increasingly seen in terms of rising great power competition. You know, there's a long-term competition underway here between the United States and China to really compete for geopolitical influence. And I think as a result of that, domestic and foreign policies are becoming more entwined in both the US and China. And both sides are lining up for this a really long-term competition that will involve more levels of government, more government control and oversight of strategic industries. And in this sense, I think China's recent actions can be seen as, an attempt to exert more control over strategic industries that it sees being important to competing with the United States. Tech, of course, is at the top of that list. So I think we should expect more regulation in that area. But I do think, there's more regulation coming, and it is more of a structural shift in how, excuse me, how China is going to be operating in the markets. And there's another important domestic political aspect here to this. I think President Xi is very focused on public opinion in China, as well as the potential negative aspects of economic inequality in that country. So I think we should expect more actions like we've seen. For example, reducing costs of online tutoring and education, more regulation of gaming and gambling sectors, things that promote a healthier Chinese society. These types of regulations on this side of the equation happen to be popular, and I think those are very important to President Xi's long-term domestic political goals. So I do think it's structural. I do think it's tied to the broader geopolitical competition, but I also think that there are strong domestic factors at play in China too.
Great. And how do you see the long-term commercial relationship between China and United States under the Biden administration? That's another topic that I know you wrote about a lot, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure, we could spend a week on this topic. But I'll start by saying that, if you're going to pay attention to one geopolitical development over the next 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, it's the direction of the U.S.-China relationship. And, that to me is going to set, the terms for whether or not we have, a managed competition or something, more disruptive to the markets. And to me, I'm a fan of realism in politics. I think the Thucydides trap framework that's so popular in DC policy circles is the right way to view this, because that's the way the policymakers are looking at it. And very simply, the Thucydides trap goes all the way back to Thucydides, the world's first historian who was back in ancient Greece studying Athens versus Sparta. It's a very simple concept. It's, can an existing power like the United States accept the rise of a challenger peacefully? And so far the signs are not good. Typically what happens is the existing power feels threatened, takes actions to try to decrease the rapid growth of the challenger. That leads to a cascading negative set of impacts. I think that script is probably the closest to what we're on right now with the U.S.-China relationship. And though the Thucydides trap over the centuries has been very difficult to manage. So I think we're in that situation. It's going to be challenging to manage. U.S.-China relations do remain on a significant downward path under the Biden administration. COVID was a big part of this, but I think that these existing geopolitical strains were in the relationship. They've been accelerated, and this is the new geopolitical normal. And we should, therefore, from a market perspective, expect a more activist and a more coordinated regulatory environment in DC as well, as managed strategic competition with China becomes further institutionalized and increasingly bipartisan, particularly in industries that are viewed as central to this ongoing geopolitical competition. I've been following Washington for 20 years. I've never seen an issue that has had such broad bipartisan support as the rise of China and what that means to the long-term geopolitical influence of the United States. That's saying a lot in the current divided domestic political situation we have in Washington. So I think that's very important. As for the main commercial implications of this, I think this means faster economic decoupling in what the US and China determined to be strategic sectors. And I think that means more policy risk in these narrow areas that are seen as critical to this emerging great power competition. I also think that there are elevated geopolitical risks around the world right now in the US-China relationship that could lead to a sudden rupture in US-China relations. And so, this could happen a lot faster than many in the markets anticipate. In terms of these new emerging battlefields that I think get the most attention, today and into the future, the militarization of space, including hypersonic weapons and advanced missile defenses, anything related to advanced technology, because these changes are at the center of shifting military doctrines in the US and China. So semiconductors are at the top of that list because they're central to every advanced military application. Next-gen communications like 5G, that's critical to US military communications and daily operations of the US military. Electric vehicles and green tech, broadly speaking, because that's essential to reducing the US military fossil fuel dependency. The Pentagon is the world's largest consumer of petroleum on a day-to-day basis, and so they're trying to wean themselves off from that, as well as from the macro perspective, all the positive macro externalities that a shift to a greener economy would produce. So there's a big competition underway globally as to who's going to own green tech. This also includes rare earth minerals, which are necessary for energy transition. It includes robotics and automation, aerospace, pharma and biotech, which are now being seen in a more strategic light given the COVID vulnerabilities that were revealed. And then the biggest one, Samuel, and the one that has the two that have the most attention from the national security side are artificial intelligence as applied to national security applications. And then beyond that, the game-changing potential of quantum computing and what that might mean for all sorts of military applications. And so, it's a broad set of competition across many industries. And I do think the right way to think about this is through this lens of great power competition and how are these two countries trying to compete in these areas that are so critical.
And there is another one, another thing that's very important as well, which is currency. How do you see the impact of this scenario in the US dollar and to the yuan as well, the currency from China? How do you see the relationship between both?
Sure, it's critical, and right now I think that we're likely to have a mixed impact on the dollar and currencies in general. I think the direction of the dollar will be driven more by long-term market and macro fundamentals, more than it will be by geopolitics. This includes monetary policy, fiscal policy, the outlook for COVID and how that changes economic structure and demand, and a bunch of others that that are traditional, for currency analysis. What we're watching particularly closely at Wellington is the embrace of digital currencies by central banks and what this impact may eventually have on the existing global financial architecture. It's too early to say on what the long-term impacts are going to be here, but I think these developments on the digital currency side are being very closely monitored in Washington, certainly in Beijing, other parts of the world. They have the full attention of policymakers. And the big question, which we don't have an answer to yet, is will this impact the viability of the dollar as a reserve currency over the long run? It's too soon to say, but it could. And so that's where the geopolitics marries with the broader macro piece of this. But you know, it's one of the areas that we're spending a lot of time grappling with.
What about short term? Do you guys have it's not the main subject here, but do you have an opinion about the US dollar? Is it going to be weaker or what?
I mean, there's a variety of opinions at the firm. I'm in the camp that monetary policy is the main driver of short-term currency developments as well as prospects for economic growth. The macro forecasts in the U.S. remain incredibly strong. And so, you know, I would suggest that, you know, everyone on this call pay very close attention to the macro fundamentals in terms of determining the short-term currency movements.
Great. But going back to the more broad scenario, which sectors or asset classes do you see as outperformers, not in the short term, but the next 3, 4, 5 years, given your base case scenario?
Sure. Well, you know, we spoke a lot about climate piece, and you know, so adaptation, mitigation. I think that area is going to be a relative winner. You know, really for the next decade or so. Similarly, the defense industry and the national security innovation space, I think, is bound to have strong demand, given the geopolitical tensions that we've discussed so far here today. I'll make a quick distinction on the defense side of it, though. You know, there will be continuing demand for traditional defense firms, bullets, bombs, guns, planes, boats, all of that stuff as we think of as you know, defense. But I think the definition of what constitutes a defense stock is expanding because the military doctrines are shifting to a much more high-tech, much more, you know, space-related, much more AI and quantum-related battlefield. And so I think we should think differently about what actually constitutes a defense stock in the future. And the emphasis is much more on these dual-use technologies that both have civilian and military applications. So, you know, climate and defense, I think, are two long-term winners here. I do want to emphasize a couple more investment aspects here because I think it's important, and also because, you know, what we're talking about today does sound scary, but I think it's more optimistic than some of the underlying data points point to. Now, and that's because barring the worst case scenario, which obviously would be war between the U.S. and China, I do think geopolitical competition is likely to be a broad market positive and a long-running trend. And that's because a society-wide competition like this, you know, it promotes positive monetary backdrops. It promotes positive fiscal backdrops. The Biden administration, in fact, made competition with China a key talking point, for example, in pushing through the current infrastructure challenge. So, you know, policymakers have a way of using these external events to push domestic policy, and that's likely to be broadly positive. It also creates plenty of national champions around the world in these strategic sectors that we think will be investable for a very long time. Now more fundamentally, from an investment perspective, Samuel, a long-term competition like this is going to create plenty of differentiation and plenty of disruption around the world, across regions, across countries, throughout different industries, even within companies in those industries, across asset classes. And we think that's a hugely positive backdrop for actively managed strategies to find winners and losers. And I think that's true across all asset classes, frankly. And that's what I think is most important to grasp in times of big structural changes like we're seeing now. I think from an investment perspective, you need to identify the right long-term top-down macro and geopolitical trends, and then marry that with the best bottom-up investment acumen and processes that you can find. And so I'm a big supporter of thematic investing at the moment, and in a time of great structural change, really to try to get exposure to these long-term tailwinds, and then use your bottom-up analysis to really find the winners and losers.
Great. Last question about China before moving to cybersecurity. Do you guys see? I've seen dozens of predictions when China will surpass US. Is it okay for you guys, or you believe that's not going to happen? Do you think it's going to happen for sure?
Well, then if the trends continue, it will certainly happen. But on a personal level, I don't think that matters much. I think, from an investment perspective, you read the world as it is, not as you want it to be, and you allocate capital accordingly. What I think is important to watch here in this competition are the domestic political impacts of this competition, and I am quite concerned that domestic politics in both the United States and in China is making the management of this very complex relationship more difficult. And that's because it's very easy to score political points at the moment by attacking the other. The approval ratings of China in the United States are at decades-long lows for a variety of reasons, but certainly COVID has exacerbated that. But that's also true in Europe, in Germany, and in France, in the UK. That's true in Australia. That's certainly true in Japan. And so, there's a lot of domestic political point scoring to be had by being tough on China. And I think that's exacerbated in the United States by the election calendar that we have here. We have very important midterm elections coming up, next year. And then the presidential election after that. I think we're going to have both the Republicans and the Democrats competing to see how tough they can be on China. And so the policy environment, is going to be a more restrictive one. And I think that's true, globally, for the reason that it's easy to score domestic political points. That's also true from China's perspective. And you've seen, a shift in tone from China and its various state media organizations in responding to all sorts of things in the U.S.-China relationship. And so I think that the path here is for increased political friction as a result of domestic politics, but also these structural geopolitical themes that we've been discussing today. So I actually think the U.S.-China relationship probably gets worse before it gets better. And in the main lens, what that we need to follow is the policy side of it and how restrictive that gets. And as I said earlier, what really worries me is the geopolitical environment where we could have some sort of military accident between the United States and China that radically changes the policy backdrop and leads to a sudden rupture in U.S.-China relations. That's not my base case, but given the conditions and given the amount of military activity that's happening in the region and elsewhere, the risk of a military accident that escalates is higher than it's been in decades, and that's a big concern with my national security contacts in Washington and elsewhere. Is this fear of an accidental conflict that somehow spirals out of control? So those are the various aspects of how I think about this and what policymakers are concerned about.
One question that wasn't in the script, but I don't know if you have the answer, but where run to in the case of a conflict? I mean, in terms of asset classes. Is there a question for that?
So there are no winners in a conflict between the United States and China. Obviously, it would depend on the nature of the conflict, how long it occurred, how much damage was done to physical infrastructure. Clearly, there would be massive disruptions to global trade. Clearly, there would be massive supply chain disruptions given China's economic integration with, of course, the United States, but with every other country in the world. And so, you know, I could go on and on here. And of course, policymakers are not immune to that. And, you know, there is no desire on either side for conflict. But I do think in this environment, you know, what we need to worry about is an accident. You know, history is full of surprises and, you know, dumb things happening that, you know, spiral out of control.
Yeah.
And I will say, you know, in my conversations with policymakers, the most common analogy that I hear from them relates to World War I, you know, the years before World War I, where you had great powers aligning against each other, you know, in multiple spheres. That's, you know, obviously history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but, you know, that's probably the closest analogy that, you know, we have today. Is like we have Russia, we have the United States, we have China, we have India, we have these great powers sort of restructuring what the global geopolitical backdrop looks like. And it's in these moments where, you know, catastrophes can happen. Again, not my base case.
Okay.
But, you know, that's sort of the professional read of, you know, what happens in that worst case scenario.
Great. In a report released in the beginning of this year, the World Economic Forum pointed that among the 5 highest likelihood risks of the next 10 years, cybersecurity was one of them. And in fact, data security risk has escalated since the pandemic began. We saw the US Treasury being attacked, an oil pipeline being attacked. A big chain of medical labs in Brazil suffered this same problem recently, among dozens of other examples we could talk about. Could you share your thoughts on that, please? The third C, cybersecurity.
Yes, you know, and like climate change, you know, I also think this is underappreciated by markets because there's a fundamental shift underway in great power competition that's directly related to the increase in cyber attacks that we're seeing now. This has been happening gradually for years, and countries around the world have been updating their capacity to operate in the cyber realm, but so have, you know, non-state actors. But really, in the past year or so, as you say, we've seen a big uptick in this. I think we should expect more of that, and I think companies and Western companies in particular are becoming part of this great power competition battlefield that we've been discussing here today. You know, we've seen, you know, this uptick coming from a number of areas. You know, Russia is at the top of the list here. China has been singled out by the Biden administration for major attacks on U.S. companies, but also North Korea, Iran, a whole host of non-state actors. You know, and what's been different in the past several months, Samuel, is the willingness of cyber actors to cross established lines. In previous years, there was sort of an unspoken agreement to not hit critical infrastructure of your adversaries. And there was an attack here in the United States on colonial, you know, fuel supplies. There's been an attack on food supplies, right? Food and energy, those are critical assets. And so, you know, there's an issue here with escalation, and it's known as gray zone conflict. That's the slang term for it in national security circles. But what gray zone conflict is, you know, countries essentially being at war with each other without shooting at each other. And I think that gray zone piece of this is an increasingly important aspect of the international backdrop, and particularly with regard to great power competition. For the simple reason that, in this world, it's generally not a good idea, as we've discussed, to get into a shooting war with adversaries who possess significant military capacity, up to and including, frankly, nuclear weapons. And I think in this emerging great power competition framework, cyber is becoming and will continue to be a more important national security tool, really for governments worldwide. And that means, from our perspective as investors, from our perspective as people who run companies, that means higher risks, higher costs, a whole new landscape for companies to navigate in terms of how do you deal with these new risks. And then on the investment side, that means plenty of investment opportunities and risks for firms like Wellington and others to think through as these shadow conflicts continue to intensify in coming years. So I view cyber as, again, like the US-China competition, sort of the new normal of geopolitical competition and conflict. And again, to put a more positive spin on it, it's better to compete in these areas than it is to compete on the battlefield. And so I think that's sort of the path that we're on. But again, it's a significant development, and it's one that frankly policymakers in the U.S. are struggling with.
Great. Where do you see opportunities in this area, and how is Wellington approaching this theme?
Sure. Well, again, it's marrying the right top-down themes with finding the best companies in these spaces. And so in this space, it's really about cyber protection, data security, and finding the companies in these spaces that have the best management and the best market share and the best growth opportunities. So obviously there's going to be more attention paid to this aspect of it. It also reveals more vulnerabilities to critical infrastructure, and so so we have to look more closely at cybersecurity practices across the board, but particularly in industries and companies that have been targeted and will continue to be targeted. And then I would say, like in geopolitical risk in general, again, this creates all sorts of opportunities for differentiation. So, it's going to be different on a country by country basis, on an industry by industry basis, on a company by company basis. So again, it creates plenty of opportunities for active management.
Great. Thomas, if you could give a final message wrapping up the 3 C's, what would that be?
So, my final message would be that we're in a moment of structural change. And that structural change is being driven by normal things like geopolitical competition. And so, those, that aspect of it, of the changing geopolitical backdrop is more predictable. But I think that is one of the things to pay attention to, is the shifting backdrop. Climate change is exacerbating and accelerating these more normal geopolitical shifts. And then the last thing I would say is just domestic political polarization as a broad theme also impacts the geopolitical environment. And to me, it's these intersection of these 3 big structural shifts: the changing world order, the impact of climate change on this, and then how domestic politics can respond to this in an increasingly fractured political backdrop. Those are the 3 things to pay attention to. There are opportunities and excellent opportunities in each of these, but really think long-term, really think thematically, and think about the connection between these structural shifts. One would be enough to manage. We have 3 that are hitting us simultaneously. And so, do your homework.
Great. Thomas, thank you very much for sharing with us your knowledge. And thank you all for the audience in one more edition of Expert. I hope you enjoy all the other lectures being held during these days. Thomas, thank you very much.
Samuel, it was my pleasure, and thanks again for inviting me. It's been a tremendous honor.
Bye-bye.